Ben here, and I'm here to talk to you today about contention level arguments and constructing contention level arguments. So we're going to be spending most of our time today discussing what is involved in constructing contention, why it matters, and what it does for you in round. Contention level arguments are where you offer the real justification for why you believe that the resolution is true or false. So you might recall from our discussion yesterday that we started out by talking about the value and the value criterion. And the whole idea behind that discussion is that the value and value criterion together work to narrow down what counts as proving the resolution true or false. In moving on to discuss contentions, then, you are actually finally making the positive arguments about why you believe the resolution is true or false, specifically in reference to the value or value criterion that you've defended. So remember, since you've spent the first part of your case creating and defending a value criterion, all of your contention level arguments should link back into, or their impacts, why they matter, only matters in terms of how it relates back to your value criterion, at least for now. So, just to refresh then, the idea behind a contention level argument is this is where you generate offense in round. You will never win a debate round, or at least on your own case, unless you are extending contention level offense in the second, or in the first and the second rebuttal. And this offense matters insofar as it links back to a value criterion and probably your own value criterion, which you'll also be trying to defend throughout the round. So, let's talk about then what a contention argument should consist of. What should it look like? So, my argument is going to be that any contention level argument should have at least three main parts. And we'll get down into more of the nitty-gritty of this in a minute. But the first part is a claim, which is simply the thesis or the main proposition that you are defending within that contention. So, most debate cases will have at least two contentions, if not three contentions, that all will make independent claims or independent arguments that say, for whatever reason, we should affirm the resolution, or for whatever reason, we should negate the resolution because of certain impacts back to the criterion that you've defended. So the claim is going to be the main thesis or proposition that you're defending. So that's the first part. The second part is the warrant, which is a reason why the claim is true. So you may provide several warrants for one claim depending on what it is, and the more warrants you're able to provide, the stronger the claim will often be. So if you're defending what you believe to be a very important argument in your case, and typically you shouldn't be making arguments you think are unimportant, oftentimes what you'll do is you'll make the claim and then say, this is true for three reasons, and you will list off your warrants and substantiate the reasons why you believe that particular claim is true. So we have the claim being the thesis or the main argument, a summary of the main argument. A warrant, which is the reason or reasons that this is true. And then finally, the third part is the implication or the impact. And this is the reason why the claim you're making matters. And this is specifically where you will link your contention level argumentation to your value criterion. You are probably familiar from your experience, even briefly in camp or debating people in the past, where people employ multiple contention level arguments. So at the end of the lecture today, we'll talk about a couple of ways in which you can think about the relationship between different contention level arguments. But I want to clarify something about organization very quickly, is that people will number their contentions, contention 1, contention 2, contention 3, or people will sometimes say contention 1 and then start into subpoints. So contention 1, subpoint A, subpoint B, subpoint C. Now, this does not always have a definite rhyme or reason depending on the debater and depending on how they're employing this terminology. But I want to say that there are two different ways you might see this occurring that might help you understand what's going on when you face an argument or a contention level argument with multiple subpoints, or a person who is reading multiple contentions with multiple subpoints. So sometimes a subpoint will literally serve the function of doing the A, B, C, that is the claim, warrant, impact, that we're talking about so far. So you might have the subpoint A being the claim, subpoint A is an explanation of the claim, subpoint B might be your warrant or your multiple warrants for why your claim's true, and subpoint C might be the implications. Other times, you'll see subpoints employed in more complicated arguments in which that depend on one another. So you might have somebody who is making a broader argument that says something like, let's use the example, which we'll use again in a second, that civil disobedience is morally justified inside a democracy. You might see people make the argument, for instance, that says civil disobedience is necessary to fight structural oppression. And A might be one reason why that's true, B might be another reason why that's true, and C might be a third reason why that's true. Each one of those might have independent claims, warrants, and implications. So it's important to keep in mind that sometimes you're making a more complicated style of argument, in which case you might have the crux of the argument developed over multiple subpoints, and that's the real organizational function of subpoints. Other times, people might use it to make different types of independent arguments, and you have to be perceptive of how your opponent is doing that so you don't drop something that is independently offensive or fail to respond to something that really matters in the round. So let's give an example then. Let's take the resolution that we were talking about most often last time, which is resolved. Civic disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. Now, when we are constructing a contention level argument that would support the truth of this claim, let's say that we want to argue that civic disobedience promotes enfranchisement. That is, civic disobedience allows for marginalized or oppressed groups to vote where before they wouldn't be able to. So that would be your claim. Civic disobedience promotes enfranchisement. Now, you would have to think about reasons why that claim would be true. You would have to provide argumentation to support the truth of that claim. So let's say then that you provide a warrant. That's the B part, the warrant, the reason why it's true. And you provide the example, for instance, of the civil rights movement. And you say that the civil rights movement offers historical proof that there are circumstances in which citizens are excluded from democracies, or marginalized or oppressed groups are excluded from democracies, and civil disobedience has been a key measure to ensure the enfranchisement of those disenfranchised groups. So that's pretty intuitive so far. Yeah, you have the claim, civic disobedience promotes enfranchisement. And then you have the warrant, which is that historically we have seen instances in which marginalized groups are given enfranchisement partly because social movements tend to incorporate civil disobedience as a strategy. Now, when you're moving on to the third point then, you need to think about its specific link back to the value criterion. So you've established then, theoretically, and of course providing multiple warrants for this would be useful, but you've established A, what the claim is, and B, what a warrant for that is, which is that historically we've seen this in examples like the civil rights movement. Now, the last part of it, the implication, is when you need to specifically make the argument that links this back up to your value criterion. So, you have to make the argument, in this case, that enfranchising oppressed or minority groups or marginalized groups inside of democracies is something that is necessary to morality within a democracy, or is something that is necessary to protecting democracy in some capacity, yeah? And here's the really important part about this, is the specific way in which you have articulated your value criterion and the specific way you've given justifications for it matter a lot in terms of how you want to make these implication arguments. So, for instance, if you have in your value and value criterion made the argument that the value criterion ought to be enfranchisement, yeah, or popular representation, let's say, and you've said that because in a democracy, moral justification is something that is bound up to, or bound up with, the popular will. Or in a democracy, what we think about as being moral, morally justified, is necessarily tied to the ability of the citizenry to express themselves and determine their own political fate, or what happens in politics inside of the United States. So if you have made the argument in your value criterion level that popular representation is your value criterion because it's necessary for morality in a democracy, then it's very intuitive for you to go about making the impact argument or the implication argument that says enfranchisement then matters in terms of your value criterion, links back to your value criterion, because enfranchisement is the only way we ensure popular representation. So just to break that down, if your value criterion was something like popular representation, a link between enfranchisement and popular representation would make the argument that enfranchising more people helps with popular representation, so it links back to your value criterion and counts as offense there. So, on the other hand, if your value criterion was something that didn't have to do with popular representation, let's say, as we were talking about last time, your value for this resolution was morality, and you were saying that what is morally justified in a democracy is what is utilitarian good. That is what creates more good than bad. So, if that is the case, you're going to have to do a lot more and different kinds of work in your implication section to link it back to your value criterion. So, for instance, you might have to argue then that enfranchisement is good because historically it has brought more happiness to countries, that well-enfranchised countries are unlikely to go to war with each other, and therefore it minimizes the risk of conflict, that inside of democracies with good enfranchisement, more rights are protected, and that leads to a greater good for the greatest number. So in that circumstance, then, you can see that I have to do a little bit more work, because my value criterion doesn't tell us already, if it's utilitarianism, that enfranchisement is good. But if my value criterion does tell us that enfranchisement is good, I have a direct link that needs a lot less work between the two. So this should tell us a couple of things then. The most important thing it should tell us is that every time we make an offensive argument in the round, it needs to be linked back to our value criterion in order for it to matter as contention level offense, as offense for our case, for our position. And the second thing is that it's not just about saying the words that this links back to your value criterion. You need to be specifically thinking about what value criterion you've adopted, what its advantages are, what is specific about it, and be making as concrete a link back as you can. So, having said that, given that general overview of claim, warrant, impact structure, I'm going to talk a little bit more about warrants, because these are one of the more important things that you will have to learn in debate rounds, and this is when evidence usually comes in. So let's talk about 3 different kinds of warrants. So the first kind of warrant is what we might call an analytic or an argumentative warrant. And what that is to say is that you are, either by referring to typically philosophical evidence or other sorts of politically opinionated evidence, making an argument for the truth of a given position that is based in logic, that is based in argumentation, and not based in referencing statistics or things that happen in the real world. So let's give a concrete example. So if I wanted to warrant the argument that in a democracy, popular representation is necessary, I might say something like, democracy is by definition the rule or the representation of the people. So any moral democracy must provide for maximum popular representation. So the first part of the argument is I'm giving you a definition of what democracy is, how we understand democracy. And I'm saying from that definition, what we can deduce is that any democracy must provide for popular representation, because otherwise it is internally contradictory. Otherwise, it's not upholding its aims or what is important to it as a democracy. So that kind of argument is one that is substantive, that you can make yourself in most circumstances, but you might want to rely on external evidence for, on professional evidence for, either because they make good arguments or because they make arguments with more sophistication or clarity or succinctness than you might be able to yourself. So if I wanted to then make an argument about why democracy is so, why popular representation is so central to democracy, I would likely do research on democratic theory and what people have argued is important about democracy and why they have argued that as being true. And I would dig up evidence that would help support the claims that I wanted to make about democracy. In an analytic sense, in an argumentative sense in this way, I wouldn't necessarily be looking for things that tell us what really existing empirical democracies have done, that is, democracies in the world have done. I'm looking to make arguments about what is involved in democracy on a more abstract level. Yeah? So that's an analytic sort of claim. So you might think of another example of this as being democracy depends on the protection of rights. Why does the democracy depend on the protection of rights? Because democracy is based on the idea that individuals ought to be able to rule themselves. The notion that individuals ought to be able to rule themselves requires a certain internal dignity to citizens that isn't guaranteed by the state, but is guaranteed in advance, which is how the state derives its power in the first place. So you can see that I'm making justifications for why these things are true based on a definitional understanding of what democracy is, based on my analysis of the concept, as opposed to making reference to the real world, which distinguishes it from the second kind of warrant we need to talk about, which is an empirical warrant. So an empirical warrant is when we reference real-world statistics or real-world occurrences as evidence for the claims that we're making. So if I wanted to make the argument, for instance, as we were before, that civil disobedience increases enfranchisement, that is a claim about the real world, and this is really important. In order to support any claim you make about the real world, you need to be referencing some kind of evidence that supports that claim, that demonstrates the empirical, being the concrete or real-world veracity, truthfulness of that claim. So, if I wanted to say that historically we have seen civil disobedience increase rather than decrease enfranchisement, I would need to read you statistics about that. In the example we gave so far, I offered you one kind of way of thinking about giving an empirical claim, which is a historical example. Now, a historical example has its risks and its benefits. So, a benefit of a historical example is that it is concrete, it demonstrates something that happened in the real world, and it is easily communicable to your judges, and something that we can clearly visualize and clearly understand the impacts of. On the other hand, a disadvantage of using a single empirical example or a single historical example to warrant your claim is that because the civil rights movement promoted enfranchisement, that does not mean in every single circumstance civil disobedience has promoted enfranchisement. So, a stronger or more robust use of empirical evidence would be one in which I looked for research that says, over the course of social movements in general, or over the course of popular mobilizations, have social movements that use civil disobedience more often than not led to more enfranchisement, or led to positive political reforms. So that kind of broader claim that captures multiple instances is a lot more compelling and a lot more reliable from the evidentiary perspective, that is, in terms of evaluating the quality of evidence, because it doesn't just say something that happens in one instance, it documents a tendency or a correlation between civil disobedience and enfranchisement. So, this is an important distinction in terms of empirical warrants. So just to break it down one more time, when we're thinking about empirical warrants, sometimes we might provide anecdotal or example based empirical warrants to clarify or concretize our claims. And those are valuable, but they are more valuable if you put them in line or in context of evidence that demonstrates a broader tendency. Because people will often say, that is just one example, that doesn't prove the rule as being true. So you always want to be on guard about that when you're constructing contention level arguments. So the third type of warrant, which is also a subset of empirical warrants, are psychological claims or claims about popular beliefs. And these are two different types of warrants, but you'll see they're similar substantively. So let's talk about psychological claims, for instance. Psychological claims are claims about human behavior, human perspectives. So, for instance, you might say that people are more likely to be persuaded by civil disobedience than other kinds of protests. If you're making that kind of argument, you are making a psychological claim. You're saying that something is true about the way that people think and respond to civil disobedience in comparison to other types of protests. In order to do that, you have to provide a psychological warrant. Now, that might not be a psychological study in specific, but it has to be some kind of evidence that demonstrates that, in fact, people do respond that way. That there have been some kind of studies that have demonstrated that people are more responsive to civil disobedience, or there are studies that demonstrate that people have a harder time ignoring civil disobedience because of X, Y, and Z factors. So oftentimes you will hear people say, as a defensive argument against psychological arguments, you have a psychological claim without a psychological warrant. You are saying that people are made unhappy by this thing, but you are not providing any evidence of their actual unhappiness. So every time you are thinking about making an argument that says X people feel a certain way or think a certain way, make sure you are providing concrete empirical evidence that says that that's true. And then this brings us to our last type of claim, which is claims about popular beliefs. So anytime you make the argument that people think X or people believe Y, you have to specify who those people are. You have to think about who is people in this circumstance, and what type of population or who in the United States or who elsewhere we are saying is believing the claim that you are making. Yeah. So, for instance, if you made the claim that most people support civil disobedience in times of domestic strife or in times of oppression, you have to provide some kind of polling that reflects those figures. Yeah, if you're like, in a democracy, people support civil disobedience as a moral choice, so obviously it's moral, that might be a great argument, but you need to be citing evidence that says in a democracy people support this. And of course, that may seem intuitive, but you'll find, and you should listen to this when you're debating other people, that there are a lot of circumstances in which people make empirical claims, claims that rely on some sort of thing that has happened in the world or some sort of thing being true about the real world, without ever giving you evidence that describes the real world or shows that these things actually occur in the real world. And when people are making empirical claims without empirical warrants, when people are making psychological claims without psychological warrants, or appealing to popular opinion without giving you polls that demonstrate that popular opinion, you need to be calling on them on that bluff. And you need to be making sure that you don't make the same mistakes in your own contention level arguments. To wrap up our discussion of warrants, then, I just want to mention two other things really quickly. So, you should not, from the foregoing, get the impression that the only thing that you have to warrant in your argumentation is the claim. So we've already talked about how, in the implication, you have to specifically establish why the impact of the argument that you're making, so let's say the impact of civil disobedience increasing enfranchisement, links back to your value criterion. That might be a place where you really need to be providing more evidence in order to explain how that impact functions, or even provide some preliminary weighing, that is, some preliminary contextualization of how important that is with reference to your value criterion. And this is something that is really important to think about when it comes to the implication level of the argument. So I've said that enfranchisement is important to democracy, and civic disobedience increases enfranchisement. Now, I could then make the argument and the implication that enfranchisement is the most fundamental thing to democracy, more important than anything else. And why would that be? Because without enfranchisement, without universal enfranchisement, we can never say that a democracy is actually truly operating, because it's never the will of the people unless you have full enfranchisement. So any democracy always has the moral obligation to aim to full enfranchisement. That is the type of warrant or justification, that one being in particular an analytic justification, for why enfranchisement is necessary to democracy. Now, thinking more about the utilitarian kinds of arguments, your opponent might stand up and say, yes, that is true, but civil disobedience allows us to defy the rule of law. When the rule of law collapses, democracy itself collapses. This leads to civil war and or nuclear war. And you'll see impact trains that go out like that a lot, right? And then your opponent could say then that nuclear war obviously outweighs universal enfranchisement with reference to linking back to any criteria related to democracy. So you want to be thinking about how you might be weighing your claims against your opponent's claims when you're constructing your contention level argumentation, and you might want to think about putting some of that internalized weighing in there in the first place. So it may be true on the level of, for instance, magnitude, how bad something is, that nuclear war outweighs enfranchisement in terms of the health of democracies. But from the level of likelihood or probability, enfranchisement necessarily violates what a democracy can and can't do, or rather, disenfranchisement necessarily violates the basic conditions for democracy. So we know that 100% of the time, if you're proving that this increases enfranchisement, or you're proving that without civil disobedience there would be disenfranchisement, then it is more likely to impact a value criterion that's based on participation. Yeah? So we'll have a separate lecture when we talk about weighing, but it's important for you to keep in mind when you're constructing your contention level arguments that they're always going to be interacting with other people's arguments. Now, let's briefly review. So what have we said? We've said that we use our value and our value criterion to narrow down what matters to the resolution. Then we've said that each contention level argument we make should be a point of offense, a single argument that relates back to our value and value criterion through its implication, that demonstrates that the resolution is true or is false, because you're providing arguments that show why a good democracy, for instance, would have to do a kind of action, why a just government would have to do a kind of action, and why we would have injustice as a result of not doing the action, or vice versa, if you're negating. So that's the whole idea behind each contention level argument you make, is each contention level argument is going to be a claim, a warrant, and an implication that links back to your value criterion and demonstrates that the resolution is true or the resolution is false, because the resolution's proposition, so civil disobedience, paying reparations for taken indigenous land or to indigenous populations for historical oppression, that those actions are good for X, Y, and Z reasons. And each X, Y, and Z reason is going to be a contention level argument. Or X actions are bad for X, Y, and Z reasons. And each X, Y, and Z reason is a negative contention level argument. So I want to wrap up talking about contentions briefly by talking about how you might think about constructing multiple contention level arguments and how they might fit together. I'm going to talk about two primary approaches to constructing multiple contentions here. Although there are, of course, others that you will discover over the course of your debate career, these are the really fundamental ones. So we'll call them the independent or the dependent approach to constructing contention level argumentation. So the first one, the independent approach, functions as such. You would say that each one of your contentions is an independent argument that doesn't rely on the logic that motivates any of the other or grounds any of the other contentions. That is to say, each one of your contentions has an independent claim, warrant, and implication, and that they do not rely on one another to set up something as being true or rely on one another for their truth value. Yeah, so if the most common place that you're going to see this is in utilitarian style frameworks. So let's talk about these. So we've said, for instance, in the resolution that we've been discussing for this entire lecture, that we might adopt a utilitarian framework that says, in a democracy, what is morally justified is what is utilitarian good, that is what supplies the greatest good for the greatest number. If we take that as being true, each one of our contention level arguments might simply provide another advantage to enfranchisement that proves, therefore, that enfranchisement provides the greatest good, or sorry, that civic disobedience provides the greatest good for the greatest number. So your first argument might be the one we've been making about enfranchisement, that civic disobedience increases enfranchisement, and enfranchisement has a positive impact on people's quality of life. The second one might be saying civil disobedience is a key way to fight structural racism and oppression in the status quo, and so so civil disobedience has a net benefit because the structural racism and oppression in the status quo is really, really harmful on people, and civil disobedience helps mitigate that. So you can see why those two examples of contention level arguments don't depend on one another, that they don't necessarily have anything to do with one another, that they're both positive advantages. Argument, in contrast, is a dependent argument. That is a dependent way of structuring your contention level arguments, in which one of them relies on the other to substantiate it, or one of them relies on the other to explain its importance in reference to the value criterion. So let's give a specific example. So let's go back to thinking about the negative argument that we've been talking about so far. That is an argument for why civic disobedience is not morally permitted in a democracy. And the contention level argument would go like this, right? It would start by saying civic disobedience in a democracy violates the rule of law. Contention 1. Contention 2. Violations of the rule of law cause internal strife inside of democracies. Contention 3 would be internal strife in democracies cause violence, which is bad or morally impermissible inside of a democratic society, linking back to something like a utilitarian framework. Now you can see how in this instance, if you do not successfully prove that the rule of law is violated by you can see in this instance how if you do not successfully prove that the rule of law is violated by civic disobedience, how the second part of the argument, or the second contention that says violations of the rule of law lead to violence, would be far less compelling, or in fact would no longer matter, because you wouldn't be proving that there is a violation of the rule of law happening in the first place if you affirm the resolution. So the way that it works then is that you have to win the first part of the contention level argument, or the first contention argument, in order for the second one to have any kind of link to the resolution at all. And similarly, you would have to prove that the violation of the rule of law leads to violence, and violence is bad for democracy. You would have to win the third contention level argument that says violence is bad for democracy in order for violation of rule of law to lead to violence to matter at all either. So there are ways of setting up contention level arguments that would make one claim that you're making dependent on another. So why would you do this versus why, instead of creating a bunch of independent arguments that you could link to anything? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is if you're making a particularly complicated argument, it may oftentimes be necessary to use contentions, or at the very least subpoints of contentions, to develop independent propositions of those arguments. So it may be the case a lot of times that you are defending an argument that is complicated enough that it demands multiple contention level arguments, or at least linked subpoints in which you have to win multiple propositions to prove the claim you're making true. That's just the facts of life sometimes, and that's how you have to go about doing it. So sometimes it is what we might call a necessity. Other times it's a strategic advantage in a certain way. So oftentimes where you'll see this developed most thoroughly is in really specific kinds of arguments that, if they were true, would exclude a lot of other arguments that people would make. So let's give one final example of this being true. So let's say you were affirming and you were trying to say that civic disobedience is crucial to democracies because it is a form of democratic expression, and democracies can never effectively limit democratic expression. If that is your argument, you have to go through a number of steps to justify why that's true. So your first contention would be probably about why civic disobedience is a form of political expression. Why civic disobedience is a form of political expression. Then the second part of your argument would have to be why political expression, the ability to politically express oneself, is essential to any form of democracy. And then the last part of it then would be explaining why that implication, right, that it's essential to any form of democracy, makes your criteria, or impacts back to your criteria, or has a greater relevance in the round. So in this structuring, you have to prove the first part of the argument true in order for the second part to follow. You have to prove that civic disobedience is a form of political expression in order for it to be protected under democracy, and that's just something that is necessary to prove an argument like that true. So overall then, what we've said is that there are two different ways of approaching these constructing contention level arguments and making them relate to each other. In the one sense, you can use contention level arguments independently and don't link them to one another at all, as long as they all link to the same criterion. Otherwise, you can develop independent contention level arguments that actually relate to one another and substantiate one another, and that probably means that your argument is going to be more rigorously defended at the end of the day, but it also means that you're going to have to win more parts of your contention level argument to actually generate offense. And that's just a strategic calculation that you will have to make. There isn't a right or wrong about that. In fact, and this is where we'll close, is the taking the independent approach and assuming that you can read a bunch of advantages that link back to a utilitarian framework is a little bit problematic sometimes, because you might not give your judge a clear enough idea of how those arguments interact with one another or would interact with your opponent's arguments, and because of that, your opponent may make the claim that what you're doing is unfair because you could just go for whatever contention level argument you want to, and you wouldn't have to defend your case really at all if you didn't want to, as long as you were winning your value criterion in one advantage. So in those circumstances, that's previewing a little bit how that kind of choice might result in something like a theoretical debate, or be involved in a discussion of how the round is fair or unfair. That's a little bit ahead of where we're going right now, but I just wanted to preview why it's not just an advantage to always run utilitarian arguments and multiple advantages on the affirmative. Sometimes that works out really well, but sometimes it means that you're not making as sophisticated an argument as you might be, or sometimes it means you might be baiting yourself into some kind of theory discussion that you don't want to get into. So that's where we're going to wrap things up for today, and I'll talk to you guys next time.